That leads us nicely on to another question, actually. So just to kind of summarize in some way what you were saying, Fiona, very comprehensive answer. And I think what we're saying is that in Lehi's time and in Old Testament time, there was a cultural thing that was taking place there, or the teachings of what was happening. Lehi obviously seemed to break away from some of those cultures, and obviously through the restorative writings in the Book of Mormon, we have what we know to be of the Lord Jesus Christ and his attributes. Today, culture in our own church can sometimes stifle the true nature of God. Maybe the importance of that we discussed earlier on isn't as core and isn't as central, because sometimes we get lost in cultural things within our church. How do you feel that we can embed these really solid principles that Joseph Smith taught is absolutely essential to ensure that the culture doesn't overshadow those things? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, I would start by pointing out that if one reads the New Testament, the book of Acts, right, which is a history of the early church, the very, very first crisis that the church confronts is what? The very first crisis is, how do we sort out culture from gospel? And so there can be a Jerusalem council to say, how much of this Jewish stuff is integral to the gospel? Is circumcision really part of an eternal gospel? So my point there is simply to say that's the oldest problem in the church, is how to weed out the cultural stuff. And I think one has to just immerse oneself in, first of all, I would say the words of Joseph Smith and in the modern revelations. And the more one gets back to the gospel as understood by Joseph Smith, the more one realizes that we have to do more to free ourselves from what Fiona and I refer to as the Protestant baggage. Now, we know millions, lots and lots of Protestant people, good, earnest, honest, God-fearing people. But the word of the Lord was, the creeds are an abomination. And we have to break free of so many of these preconceptions that we have and just try to think afresh and work towards a new vocabulary.
And also, I think what fascinates me is that Brigham Young said, he's talking about the Book of Mormon, because we're going to find some of that in the Book of Mormon. We're going to find some Old Testament in the Book of Mormon. And he said, had the Book of Mormon been written in any other century, it would be very different from the 19th century version of the Book of Mormon. And why? Because the Book of Mormon was written to a primarily Calvinist Protestant public. It was a religious vocabulary that was required that they would understand in order to build the bridge to bring them over into the restored gospel of Jesus Christ. And I think that's really, really important. I think it helps us understand more some of the disquieting language we find in the Book of Mormon, apart from the fact that it was also edited by a general who was in a war committing genocide. So that, just looking at the life and of the editor of the Book of Mormon himself is that he's going to spend a lot of attention on war, and he's going to make very clear distinctions between black and white. Generals don't understand nuance, especially if they're engaged in that type of a warfare. You have to have the enemy as portrayed as non-human or subhuman, and that you were valiant. And so when you put all of these things together, then for me anyway, it sort of broadens the whole horizon. It broadens the perspective and helps me feel more comfortable. We're talking with human beings, and God is trying to converse with them, and that's very difficult.
Yeah, I love what you wrote a little bit about this. I think it was in The Crucible of Doubt, where we look upon culture. Maybe we didn't use the word culture in the book. I'm saying we as if I was a co-writer. Sorry, you didn't use the word culture maybe, but you likened it to a traffic scenario. And that we're always complaining about the people in front of us. Why don't they hurry up? We're part of the problem. We're sitting in traffic as well, and there's people behind us saying the same thing about us. So I guess culture isn't always a negative thing, and if it is, we're part of that as well. So,
absolutely, yeah. And there's just no way to overstate how difficult it is for God to speak to us through our cultural lens.
Yeah. No, thank you for that.